At 35,000 feet, nothing is supposed to feel urgent. There are no warning sirens at cruise altitude, no violent maneuvers, no visual cues that announce disaster. The sky looks the same whether it is about to kill you or let you pass unharmed. That is why the most dangerous moments in aviation rarely feel dramatic when they begin. They arrive quietly, hidden inside numbers that still look acceptable until they are not. The formation had been airborne for just under an hour when the first sign appeared, subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone not actively looking for it. 11 aircraft, identical in configuration and mission role, were transiting controlled airspace under an instrument flight rules clearance. The operation was administrative in nature, a coordinated repositioning flight designed to move assets efficiently rather than test crews or machines. It was the kind of mission that rewarded discipline, not creativity. Weather briefings earlier that morning had acknowledged layered cloud cover and a broad icing band later in the descent profile. Nothing exceptional, no red flags. Forecast models showed stable temperature gradients at cruise altitude, safely outside critical icing envelopes. Fuel planning accounted for alternates. Emergency procedures were reviewed, then filed away where they belonged, unlikely to be needed. The lead aircraft was flown by a pilot whose reputation was built on procedural compliance rather than improvisation. He was known among his peers as reliable, methodical, almost conservative. Instructors trusted him with junior wingmen precisely because he did not chase instinct at the expense of doctrine. His decision-making history showed no appetite for unnecessary risk, no record of bending rules for convenience. At cruise, automation carried most of the workload. Engine parameters were stable. Airspeed held within a narrow tolerance band. The aircraft rode smooth air above the weather, the kind of high-altitude environment that encourages complacency without appearing to do so. Radio traffic was minimal, limited to required position calls and occasional acknowledgments from air traffic control. Then the temperature indication shifted. It was not dramatic, just a fractional deviation from forecast values, a slow decline that did not trigger alerts or violate limits. The pilot noticed it because experience had trained him to distrust comfort. He cross-checked against secondary displays. The numbers were consistent, still legal, still safe, according to every checklist on board. Moments later, a faint vibration made itself known through the control column. Not turbulence, not enough to rattle instruments, just a persistent texture in the airframe that hadn't been there before. The kind of sensation pilots learn to catalog rather than react to, because reacting too early can be as dangerous as reacting too late. One by one, similar observations began filtering in from the rest of the formation. Each report was tentative, cautious in tone. No one wanted to be the first to declare a problem that could not yet be defined. Slight airspeed fluctuations, controls that felt marginally heavier than expected, engine response that lagged by fractions of a second, imperceptible to software, noticeable to humans. Individually, none of it met the threshold for action. Collectively, it painted a picture that no procedure addressed directly. The weather radar showed nothing ahead that justified concern. Radar rarely does in cases like this. Supercooled moisture does not announce itself with bright returns or dramatic shapes. It exists in thin layers, invisible to sensors designed to detect precipitation rather than physics. The formation was flying into one of those layers now. A narrow band of severe icing displaced vertically from forecasts by an atmospheric inversion that had not been captured in briefing data. It was a deviation small enough to be ignored by models and lethal enough to matter. Standard operating procedures were clear. Maintain assigned altitude unless cleared. Deviations without authorization were violations, regardless of intent. Unauthorized descents triggered reports, reviews, and investigations that extended well beyond the cockpit. Careers had been damaged for less. The pilot knew all of this. He also knew what cascading failure looked like. He requested a lower altitude, citing performance concerns. The controller acknowledged, then delayed. Traffic below, maintain present altitude, standby. Standby was not a solution. It was a clock. The vibration intensified. Anti-ice systems were already operating near their limits, struggling against conditions they were never designed to handle at this altitude. The aircraft was still controllable, still legal, still airborne, but the margin was eroding in ways no checklist could quantify. The pilot disengaged the autopilot, not because it had failed, but because what came next could not be delegated. Block B. The descent began before permission was granted. It was shallow, controlled, and deliberate. An action that would later be measured in feet per minute and judged in transcripts rather than lived experience. The pilot announced the maneuver over the formation frequency in clear, unambiguous terms. There was no hesitation in his voice, no invitation for discussion. The command carried weight not because of rank, but because every pilot listening felt the same pressure building in their aircraft. The formation followed. As altitude decreased, the change was immediate. Outside air temperature rose just enough to matter. The airflow across the wings altered, disrupting ice secretion patterns that had been forming faster than systems could shed them. Vibration softened, then diminished. Control forces eased. Engine response sharpened from sluggish to predictable. The aircraft were still contaminated, but no longer losing the fight. Air traffic control responded sharply, demanding justification for the deviation. The pilot answered with precise language, chosen carefully. Severe unforecast icing. Immediate safety of flight. Phrases that carried legal significance as much as operational meaning. He did not argue. He did not apologize. He stated facts. Below them, the air was hostile but survivable. Above them, it had been quietly lethal. The descent continued until the formation reached an altitude where onboard systems could operate within design parameters. Only then did the pilot level off and re-engage automation. Only then did the physiological response arrive, the delayed adrenaline surge that follows decisions made under uncertainty rather than fear. Post-descent reports from the other aircraft confirmed what instinct had already concluded. Ice thickness measurements exceeded expectations. Data traces showed performance degradation inconsistent with forecasts and briefings. What had felt like a collective unease at altitude was now clearly identifiable as a shared threat. Had the formation remained at cruise even a few minutes longer, outcomes would have diverged rapidly and unpredictably. One aircraft might have suffered a compressor stall. Another could have experienced asymmetric lift loss, severe enough to force an emergency descent under far worse conditions. 11 separate emergencies, unfolding simultaneously with limited controller capacity to manage them. Instead, there was only one procedural violation. On the ground, physical evidence replaced speculation. Ice residue clung to protected surfaces where it should never have formed. Maintenance crews, initially skeptical, became quiet as inspection data accumulated. The machines told a story that aligned perfectly with the pilot's decision-making timeline. The investigation that followed was methodical and unsentimental. Weather models were re-examined, forecast errors identified, communication logs dissected down to the second. The unauthorized descent was acknowledged without embellishment, documented exactly as it occurred. The conclusion was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Procedures had been correct for the conditions that were expected and insufficient for the conditions that existed. No commendation followed, no punishment either. The deviation was classified as justified by safety of flight, a bureaucratic resolution that closed the case without ceremony. Within the squadron, however, the incident took on a different meaning. It was not remembered as an act of heroism. It was remembered as a reminder that the most dangerous threats rarely announce themselves, and that sometimes the line between compliance and catastrophe is measured in a few thousand feet. Above that altitude, the sky kept its secret. The danger did not end when the aircraft stabilized. In aviation, survival is often mistaken for resolution. But the moments after a crisis, when machines are still airborne and crews are still breathing, are where consequences begin to take shape. The descent had saved the formation from an immediate aerodynamic failure, but it had also triggered a different kind of threat, one that moved more slowly and carried no physical warning signs. The pilot knew this before the wheels ever touched the runway. As the formation proceeded toward its destination, radio traffic increased, not with urgency, but with formality. Controllers requested confirmations. Supervisors were looped in. The tone was polite, procedural, and unmistakably serious. Unauthorized altitude deviations were rare. Unauthorized deviations involving 11 aircraft were almost unheard of. The flight completed without further incident, but the atmosphere had changed. The aircraft landed one by one, each rollout uneventful, each shutdown deceptively ordinary. Ground crews moved in as usual, chalking wheels, connecting power, beginning post-flight checks. To an outside observer, it looked like any other arrival. Inside the squadron, it felt nothing like one. Initial maintenance inspections revealed ice residue in places where it should not have existed, areas protected by systems designed specifically to prevent accumulation. Engineers documented the findings carefully, aware that every photograph and sensor reading would soon be scrutinized. Data cartridges were removed from each aircraft, labeled and secured. Flight data recorders do not forget, and they do not interpret. They simply tell the truth in numbers. The pilot was called in for immediate debrief. The room was small, windowless, deliberately neutral. No raised voices, no accusations, just questions, asked in a sequence designed to establish facts before narratives could form. Timestamps, altitudes, airspeeds, exact phrasing used over the radio. The pilot answered calmly, precisely, resisting the temptation to editorialize. He knew better than to frame the story emotionally. Emotion invites doubt. Data does not. As the hours passed, the scope of the incident widened. Weather officers revisited forecast models, initially confident that nothing extraordinary had been predicted. But confidence eroded as they began layering real-world data over theoretical outputs. Satellite imagery showed subtle discrepancies. Upper air soundings hinted at a temperature inversion that had been underestimated, its vertical displacement just enough to place the formation directly into a severe icing band. What had seemed impossible that morning was now merely improbable. Meanwhile, command channels activated. Reports were drafted and routed upward, stripped of color and personality. An unauthorized descent by a formation leader, justified by safety of flight concerns. 11 aircraft involved, no injuries, no damage beyond ice contamination. The words were factual, clean, and heavy, with implication. The pilot returned home late that night, physically exhausted but mentally alert. Sleep did not come easily. He replayed the decision repeatedly, not out of doubt, but out of habit. Aviators are trained to deconstruct their own actions long before anyone else does. In every replay, the same conclusion emerged. The descent had been necessary. That did not mean it would be accepted. By morning, the incident had reached a level where individual judgment no longer mattered. Once an event crosses a certain threshold, it stops belonging to the people who lived it and starts belonging to the institution that must explain it. The escalation was no longer aerodynamic, it was procedural. The formal investigation began on the third day. A review board was convened, composed of pilots, engineers, safety officers, and command representatives. Each brought a different lens to the same sequence of events. None were there to assign blame, not officially. Their task was to determine whether the system had functioned as designed, and if not, where responsibility truly lay. The pilot's unauthorized descent sat at the center of the discussion like an exposed nerve. From a purely regulatory standpoint, the violation was clear. Clearance had not been granted. Traffic separation had been compromised, if only briefly. Protocols existed precisely to prevent unilateral decisions from cascading into airspace conflicts. These were not abstract concerns. They were lessons written in accident reports spanning decades. Yet the data complicated the narrative. Flight recorder analysis showed progressive performance degradation, beginning well before any warning thresholds were crossed. Engine inlet temperature margins narrowed. Ice accretion rates exceeded modeled expectations. Control inputs increased measurably, though not enough to trigger alerts. In isolation, each parameter remained within limits. Together, they told a different story, one of convergence toward failure rather than sudden catastrophe. The board debated timelines. How long could the formation have remained at altitude before outcomes diverged? 2 minutes? 5? 10? No one could say with certainty. Aviation safety is built on margins precisely because certainty rarely exists. Weather specialists presented their findings next. The forecast had not been negligent, but it had been incomplete. The inversion layer responsible for the icing band had been transient, narrow, and displaced vertically just enough to evade standard modeling resolution. It was the kind of phenomenon that exposed the limits of prediction rather than the absence of effort. That distinction mattered. Attention returned to the pilot. His communications were replayed in full, every word parsed. His request for descent had been professional, restrained, and appropriately framed. His announcement of the maneuver had been clear and directive. There was no evidence of panic, no attempt to dramatize the situation to force compliance. He had not acted impulsively. He had acted decisively. The escalation, however, did not stop at the boardroom. Informal discussions spread through the squadron, then the wing. Pilots debated the incident quietly, often late at night, voices low. Some argued that strict adherence to procedure must remain absolute. Others countered that procedures exist to serve safety, not override it. No one disagreed on the central truth. Had the decision gone the other way, the story might not have ended with paperwork. For the pilot, the waiting was the hardest part. Investigations move slowly by design, and silence is often mistaken for judgment. He continued flying routine sorties, professionalism intact, but the uncertainty lingered. Careers in aviation are built over decades and lost in moments. He understood that reality intimately. When the board's preliminary findings were released, they were measured and cautious. The descent was classified as a deviation. The justification, severe unforecast icing, was provisionally accepted. No immediate disciplinary action was recommended, provisionally. The escalation had reached its peak not in the air, but in the tension between doctrine and reality, between rules written for the expected and decisions made for the actual. The system had not failed catastrophically, but it had been tested in a way that exposed its seams. What followed would determine whether the lesson ended with one pilot, or reshaped how future crews were taught to recognize danger before alarms ever sounded. The descent had saved 11 aircraft. The aftermath would decide whether it saved anyone else. The breaking point did not arrive with an accusation. It arrived with silence. For nearly 2 weeks after the preliminary findings were released, nothing happened. No follow-up interviews, no additional questions, no formal closure. In military aviation, silence is never neutral. It is a vacuum where speculation grows unchecked, where assumptions harden into conclusions long before facts are finalized. The pilot understood this better than most. He had seen careers stall, not because of mistakes, but because of unresolved ambiguity. As long as the incident remained open, it existed in a suspended state, neither condemned nor absolved, and suspension in institutional systems creates pressure. Operationally, the squadron continued as normal. Aircraft flew, crews briefed, executed, debriefed. Checklists were followed with renewed attention, weather briefings scrutinized more closely than usual. The incident had not changed doctrine yet, but it had sharpened awareness. Every pilot now listened differently when forecasts were discussed. Every mention of icing carried more weight. Behind the scenes, however, the investigation was intensifying. Higher command had taken interest, not because of the descent itself, but because of what it represented. 11 aircraft had simultaneously entered an unforecast hazard without triggering any formal warning system. No alerts, no procedural gates, no automated protections. The only barrier between routine flight and cascading emergencies had been human judgment. That was not a comfortable conclusion. Additional data was requested, not just from the flight, but from regional meteorological assets, civilian traffic operating at similar altitudes, and historical weather patterns along the route. Analysts searched for precedent. They found fragments, isolated cases of unexpected icing, localized inversions, but nothing on the scale of what had occurred. The more data they gathered, the clearer one fact became. The pilot's decision had not violated physics. It had violated expectation. This distinction mattered deeply. Systems are designed around expectation. Procedures are written to manage what is likely, not what is merely possible. When reality diverges from expectation without warning, institutions face a choice: adapt doctrine or enforce compliance. That choice now loomed. The pilot was summoned again, this time to a higher level review. The tone was still professional, but the stakes were unmistakably higher. The questions shifted subtly, focusing less on what he experienced and more on why he believed deviation was justified without confirmation from authority. Why not wait another minute? Why not declare an emergency first? Why not descend at a slower rate? Each question was reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a challenge to the core of his judgment. He answered carefully. He explained the cumulative nature of the cues, the absence of single triggering events, the narrowing margins that no checklist quantified. He spoke of experience, of pattern recognition, of recognizing convergence before it reached irreversibility. Not everyone in the room was convinced. Some viewed his explanation as rationalization after the fact. Others worried about the precedent it might set. If one pilot could unilaterally descend based on subjective assessment, what prevented misuse? What prevented chaos? These were not questions about this incident alone. They were questions about control. As the review progressed, internal divisions emerged. Safety officers emphasized outcomes. 11 aircraft preserved, no injuries, no damage. Operations representatives emphasized order, airspace integrity maintained by adherence, not intuition. Both were correct, and that was the problem. The pilot left the session with no indication of resolution. The breaking point that was approaching, not in the air but in doctrine. The decisive moment came, not from the cockpit but from a simulation. As part of the expanded review, analysts reconstructed the flight using recorded data and updated atmospheric modeling. They ran scenarios repeatedly, adjusting variables by narrow margins: 2 degrees colder, 1,000 feet higher, 90 seconds longer at altitude. Each run told a slightly different story. Most ended the same way. Loss of engine efficiency preceded aerodynamic degradation. Control margins eroded asymmetrically. In several runs, one or more aircraft experienced conditions that would have required immediate emergency descent, under far worse circumstances than those originally faced. In a handful, the simulations ended in loss of control scenarios that no crew coordination could have realistically recovered from. The room grew quiet as the results were presented. This was the breaking point. What had been an abstract debate about rules versus judgment was now anchored in evidence. The descent, unauthorized though it was, had intersected the timeline at precisely the point where recovery remained orderly. Any later, and the system would have been overwhelmed not by one emergency, but by many unfolding simultaneously. The question shifted. It was no longer whether the descent had been justified. It was whether the system had provided any other viable option. Command leadership faced an uncomfortable reality. The pilot had not acted outside doctrine because he was reckless. He had acted because doctrine had not recognized the scenario he was in. The rules had assumed the hazard would announce itself clearly. It had not. This realization forced a reframing of responsibility. The pilot was called in one final time. The atmosphere was different now, less interrogative, more reflective. He was informed that no disciplinary action would be taken. The deviation would stand as justified by safety of flight, formally and conclusively. But that was not the end of it. Recommendations followed. Weather modeling thresholds would be reviewed. Training syllabi updated to emphasize early recognition of converging anomalies rather than reliance on single warning triggers. Most importantly, formation leads would be explicitly empowered to act when collective risk outweighed procedural rigidity. The institution adapted, not dramatically, but meaningfully. For the pilot, the resolution was quiet. No announcement, no commendation. His record reflected the facts, nothing more. In aviation culture, this was its own form of respect. Within the squadron, the incident became a reference point, not a legend, but a lesson. Pilots spoke of it when discussing weather, when briefing long transits, when emphasizing that compliance is a tool, not a shield. The breaking point had passed, not with conflict, but with acknowledgement. The system had bent, just enough to prevent future fractures. And above all, it had recognized a truth that aviation learns repeatedly, often at great cost. The most critical decisions are rarely made when alarms are sounding, but when nothing seems wrong yet, and the margin is quietly disappearing. Resolution in military aviation rarely feels like closure. There is no final speech, no moment where tension dissolves completely. Instead, resolution arrives through paperwork, revisions, and subtle shifts in language that signal something deeper has changed. The incident was officially closed within weeks, but its influence extended far beyond the dates stamped on the final report. The formation flight faded from daily conversation, replaced by newer operations and emerging concerns. Yet traces of the event lingered in briefings, embedded quietly into how weather was discussed, how margins were framed, how uncertainty was acknowledged rather than dismissed. The system had absorbed the shock without breaking, but it had not returned to its previous shape. Updated guidance circulated several months later. It did not reference the incident directly. Institutions rarely do. Instead, it introduced refined language around unforecast environmental hazards, emphasizing early recognition of converging indicators rather than reliance on singular warning thresholds. Formation leads were reminded, carefully, deliberately, that responsibility extended beyond procedural compliance to collective survivability. The words were precise, measured, and unmistakably informed by experience. Training syllabi were adjusted next. Simulator scenarios began including ambiguous conditions that offered no clear trigger for action, forcing crews to confront the uncomfortable space between within limits and approaching failure. Instructors watched closely, less interested in which checklist was selected than in how quickly patterns were recognized. The lesson was subtle but profound. Safety is not preserved by rules alone, but by the judgment to recognize when rules no longer describe reality. The pilot returned fully to routine operations. His role did not change. His reputation, however, evolved in quiet ways. He was sought out more often during planning discussions, asked for opinions when weather forecasts appeared too clean, too confident. He did not seek authority, but it followed him nonetheless. He never framed the incident as a victory. When asked about it, he spoke in restrained terms, about margins, about uncertainty, about the danger of waiting for permission when physics has already begun its work. He emphasized that the descent was not extraordinary, that it was, in fact, the simplest available response to a situation that had not yet declared itself loudly enough. That perspective resonated. Elsewhere, analysts revisited the original weather models that morning. They documented the inversion layer not as a failure, but as a limitation, a reminder that prediction is an approximation, not a guarantee. No model was rewritten entirely. Instead, humility was added, quietly, to how outputs were interpreted. The resolution was not dramatic, but it was real. 11 aircraft had returned intact. 11 crews had walked away with nothing more than stories and data, and an institution had been nudged, slightly but meaningfully, toward acknowledging that its greatest vulnerabilities often exist not in what it prepares for, but in what it assumes will never happen. In time, the incident became something else entirely. Not a case study, not a warning, not a legend. It became background knowledge, absorbed into the collective understanding of those who flew after it. New pilots heard fragments of the story secondhand, usually in the context of weather discussions or formation leadership responsibilities. The details blurred, but the principle endured. That principle was simple. The absence of alarms does not equal the absence of danger. Aviation history is crowded with moments where crews waited for certainty that never arrived. The story stood apart because someone had recognized convergence early, before the system demanded action, before catastrophe forced clarity. The descent remained illegal, only in the narrowest sense. In every sense that mattered, it had been correct. The pilot never sought recognition, and none was formally offered. In military aviation culture, that outcome was appropriate. The highest form of validation is not praise, but trust. The quiet confidence that when ambiguity returns, the right person will act without needing instruction. Years later, when similar conditions appeared elsewhere, different crews made different decisions. Some descended earlier. Some requested deviations more assertively. None of them knew the full origin of the shift, only that acting early felt more acceptable than it once had. That is how change actually happens. Not through headlines, but through adjusted instincts. The sky above 35,000 feet remains indifferent. It offers no warnings tailored to human systems, no allowances for doctrine or hierarchy. It responds only to physics. On that day, physics had begun to close in long before anyone was officially alarmed. One pilot noticed. One decision altered the outcome for 11 aircraft. And the system, slow, careful, resistant by design, eventually listened. The story does not end with the landing. It ends every time a crew recognizes danger before it demands attention, every time judgment fills the gap between expectation and reality. That is where aviation remains safest. Not in perfect forecasts, but in the willingness to act when imperfection reveals itself. And now a question remains for you. Where are you watching this story from?